Hello and welcome to this evening's Children and Young People Scrutiny Review Board meeting. I'm Councillor Danielle Lind and I'm the Chair. If we can go through, starting on my right, from the front backwards, if we can introduce yourselves please. Thank you. Starting Tracy, thank you.
I'm Tracy Churchill, I'm Head Teacher at St Joseph's and representative of Catholic Education.
Councillor John Whitby, Vice Chair of the Board.
I'm Tracy Pearce, Derwent Ward Councillor.
I'm Omar Aslam, the Youth Mayor.
Councillor Kurt Course, I'm a councillor for Alveston Ward.
Sorry, Chair, I'm Andy Smith. I'm the Strategic Director for People Services.
Thank you. Is there any apologies, Lindsay?
Yes, we have apologies from Councillor Bonser and also Pauline Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you. No late items to be introduced by myself this evening. Any declarations of interest?
Just the usual one, Chair, the Derby City Council foster carer.
Okay, thank you. Any further? I will declare I am a STEM parent. However, I don't have any interest in these items discussed this evening. So, moving over to, can we all agree the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of October are true and accurate record of that meeting? Yep. No one against? Nope. Right, okay, so that is agreed. So, moving over to item 5 now, which is a minute extract from Audit and Governance Board from the 5th of October 2022. I'm sure you've all read it. Any comment? No comment or recommendations? Okay, can I recommend that we keep an eye on this item? I do believe it will be going to another audit again in autumn 2023. It would be good to know what progress has been made on these individual identifications that they have raised. Can we bring it back in, shall we say, 6 months for an officers to update us on what progress they've made on the issues that they've identified? Yeah, we all agreed that? Yeah, so to bring it back to the board in 6 months' time for officers to discuss and tell us what has been made in relation to mitigating the issues highlighted, which is low-risk weaknesses in government arrangements around send and decision-making processes, no overall alignment of VHGP and school transport arrangements, and weakness in monitoring and management of send contract arrangements regarding the commissioning and send liaison team. So an update on what progress are made on mitigating these issues highlighted and identified. Yep. No one against? No? Okay, so that's carried. Okay, thank you. So we will move on to the next item now. So the next item would be the Household Support Fund. However, no officer is available to present this item this evening. Unfortunately, the person that's meant to be identifying it, Bernard, is not very well at the moment. So I'm sure you can join me in wishing him well a swift recovery. So that item is to be deferred if we're all agreed. Yes? Yep, okay. That's deferred, thank you. So moving on now to the care review, item 7. I'll pass you over to Andy Smith. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really pleased to be here tonight to talk to you about the independent review of children's social care, which is sometimes referred to as the care review, but it's the same thing. And you'll learn through the presentation tonight that the review is much broader than just care. It actually straddles the whole of early help and children's social care. So what I'm going to do this evening is just run through some of the drivers behind the review. I'm going to talk about the recommendations and the themes that came out of the review, and just to give you my reflections on the strengths in the review as I see it, and some of the next steps that will be taken forward by the Department for Education as we get into the implementation phase. And then I'll obviously happy to take any questions at the end, Chair, or any reflections. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I can give you the Andy Smith view of things, I'm sure, as we progress. So colleagues may or may not have heard of this review, but it was something that we were talking about in the sector for some considerable time before it was actually launched, because the Department for Education did take some time, you could argue longer than we'd have liked, but did take some time in identifying the chair. And it was important for them to get the right person to chair the review, because clearly this review was going to be significant in terms of the breadth and the areas it was going to cover. And it was a really kind of big commitment from the DfE, because it was going to essentially take a real fundamental look at children's social care in a way that a government hadn't done for some considerable time, actually. There's been lots of reviews looking at certain aspects of children's social care and early help, but actually a review that was going to look at the end-to-end kind of journey that children and families take through, you know, a fairly complex process of early help and children's social care, which includes children in care as well as children living at home with their family or with relatives or carers, you know, is a big review with a big brief. And it was important to get the right person to chair the review who had some credibility in the sector and was going to be able to galvanise what turned out to be thousands of different views as the research was undertaken. So the review was led by somebody called Josh McAllister, who's a former teacher and founder and CEO of Frontline. And it was launched in March 2021, so, you know, really at the height of the pandemic. And, you know, the review and Josh and his team really hit the ground running at pace. And there was a real ambition, really, from the chair right from the outset to engage as many people as possible during the review. But there was a real focus on engaging families, carers, children, young people, in care leavers, you know, the whole spectrum, as well as a whole range of different stakeholders and professionals that work within children's social care. From my own perspective, as the Director of Children's Services for Derby, we met as a group of DCSs in the East Midlands with Josh McAllister and his team on a few occasions to talk about certain aspects, because clearly when we talk about what the review covered, and it was very broad, so there were certain spotlights on certain aspects of children's social care, and it was important to kind of capture the kind of empirical evidence and people's views and experiences. So I had a couple of meetings as a group of Directors of Children's Services with Josh McAllister and his team, and also my professional association, the Association of Directors of Children's Services, the ADCS, and I'll refer to that a few times tonight, also had some thematic kind of teams, round tables with Josh McAllister looking at certain aspects of the review, like the care market, agency social workers, recruitment, retention, foster carers, the whole spectrum. So there were some really good opportunities to engage from a Derby perspective and an East Midlands perspective in the review as well. And, you know, that's been really important, because what we saw when the review was published was actually a lot of the reflections that we had about the system and about what needed to change was actually reflected in the final review, which is really positive. So the review published its final report in May 22. You can see a nice picture on the screen there, and I have it as bedtime reading every night. I've got it here. It's a massively detailed review, actually, but it's very readable. And, you know, it does set out a significant number of recommendations and proposals, and it is really calling for a reset of the children's social care system, so that it acts decisively in response to abuse, provides more help to families in crisis, you know, right support, right help at the right time, as well as ensuring that we've got a care system that has relationships at its very heart, and a care system that has got sufficient types of accommodation and placement for children that can't live at home. So overall, the review was landed really well in the sector, I have to say, in terms of back last year. So in terms of the kind of exec summary, because if you just wanted to get a real sense of what the review is saying, the exec summary, which is only about 5 pages, to summarise it really well, as a good exec summary should do. And, it really does set out a very clear tone about the purpose of children's social care. So it talks about things like right help at the right time for children, young people and families, a real focus on early help in a way that we've not seen for some time actually from a DFE review, but actually taking it almost further and talking about family help as opposed to just early help. Really trying to bring about a revolution that the review talks about, a revolution in family help. Around acting decisively where children are at risk or suffering abuse in terms of how the child protection system works, particularly around how the multi-agency partners who work in the child protection system work together. And a real focus on the potential for children being raised in their wider family networks and that being much more proactively considered by local authorities and care being seen as a last resort. So it does set out a real focus on relationships being at the core for children and families, which sounds really obvious when we think about our own families and relationships we might have with our own children or with children in our wider family. But loving relationships being key for children to help them overcome adversity and abuse and challenges is really at the heart of this, and that is a golden thread throughout the whole of the review. It really spells out quite explicitly and with quite a lot of financial literacy the need for investment. This isn't a review that can be introduced without any additional investment. And in the current financial climate, which is significantly worse than when the review was published last year, undoubtedly, that is a challenge for the Treasury, but the review is really, really clear, and the DFE thus far, including the Secretary of State, has been really clear that the case for investment is well argued in the report. And actually at the back of the report, in the appendices, you've got very granular analysis around the funding that's required at all stages of the kind of recommendations in the process. And it talks about a 5-year reform programme. It talks about a reform board being established. And I'll talk more about that in a minute because that has been set up now. But it is really clear that extra funding is going to be required. This can't be done on the cheap, and it can't be done without proper burdens assessments being undertaken. It also acknowledges those kind of wider challenges that we know can impact on children and families and really impact on their development and their emotional development and their learning. As well as their relationships. It talks about poverty and inequality, it talks about pressures around domestic abuse, mental health, substance misuse, the increasing numbers of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children that are being looked after by local authorities. So it really does get into that space as well. And of course what we've also got, and we don't fully understand yet, are some of those impacts from the pandemic on children and on their lives, which are really only beginning in the main to come to the fore now. And I still think there's a lot of stuff we don't fully understand yet in terms of, the impact of lockdowns on children. So there's a whole context there, which I think is really kind of welcome. The report is structured in kind of 9 chapters. And I've put this on here just because it shows you the breadth of what this report covers. So it's much more than just care. It talks about early help and family help. It goes then into talking around child protection and the things that we have to do to be much more decisive in the child protection process. It talks about unlocking the potential of family networks, so thinking about how and where children can be brought up and raised within their own families and how that should be supported and funded. It talks about the whole transforming care, i.e. in terms of the sufficiency, making sure we've got enough placements, making sure we're tackling some of those real challenges we've got in the external residential market around high costs and sometimes poor quality. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. It talks about the experience of children and young people in the care system and how we try and make that as positive as possible so that children can reach their potential. There's a lot in there about the workforce. There's also a lot in there about tackling agency social work and social work agencies, which we've talked about, I think, at this committee before in terms of the kind of quality and the cost implications of that, and I'll talk more about that because that is potentially revolutionary, what is going to come out of the review. And it just talks about a system that's really focused on unrelentlessly really on children and families and on their outcomes. So it talks a lot about what inspection should be doing. It talks about accountability frameworks. It talks about how we're going to know we're making a difference. So it really covers everything and then some. And then of course a big section in there on implementation, particularly around the money that is going to be required to make this happen. So what you've got essentially are 80 recommendations. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go through all 80 recommendations tonight, or maybe you're disappointed I'm not going to do that. But essentially, there are 80 recommendations across 6 themes. You know, and it's really comprehensive, I have to say. And, you know, part of the kind of, I think, challenge is going to be how the government responds to this. And we haven't had the government response yet, but I'll talk more about that in a minute, Danielle, Chair, because, you know, that's been a little bit delayed. But there are essentially 6 themes which cover the 80 kind of recommendations. And the first is this revolution in family help that it talks about. And this talks about really moving from what we understand to be early help and children in need work, which is how we support children and families that might have emerging needs and might need support from professionals working with them or social workers, into something which is around family help. So really trying to think about this in a much more multidisciplinary context and how different professionals, might be family support workers, it might be mental health workers, it might be social workers, work together in a more integrated way than we maybe currently are. And that will depend on, you know, how you see things and how different councils and areas have built up their early help services. But really trying to work in a much stronger way as partners to try and deal with and respond to issues as they emerge in families, and to do that with a much more family lens and to just do that in a much more kind of dynamic way. So it talks about that, i.e. getting in there before things escalate. There's then a lot in the report around what's called a just and decisive child protection system. And again, this is about the way in which partners work together to try and help and respond to the needs of children that might be at risk of harm or abuse. And that's taking some of the learning from some of the kind of tragedies we've had recently in terms of some of the child deaths that have been reported in the national media, but also just around whether there needs to be a kind of different lens applied to this. So rather than just social workers that kind of develop their experience in this field, making this much more around a kind of development of what's being called an expert child protection practitioner. So the way in which we develop and get social workers to specialise more in child protection rather than it being maybe more generic. So there's quite a lot in there around that and around information sharing and so on. But the way in which all the partners work together is what this is about, and potentially having a more expert role for social work in a child protection process. There's then a big section on called the unlocking the potential of family networks, and this is about really trying to ensure that before children come into care, that more is done consistently to try and help children stay within their wider family. Now, you might say that happens anyway. That's been part of the way in which we work with children on the edge of care for a long time. That's a big part of the 1989 Children Act, which was, you know, a really significant piece of legislation when that came in. But this is about, I think, being much more decisive, much more joined up. The review talks about developing family network plans around not just what support's in place, but also whether or not local authorities should be funding that in order to keep children out of care and supporting families and relatives in looking after their children. And people will have different views about whether or not the state should step into that space, but that's what the review is saying should happen. And there should be better support to family members who might be seen as kinship carers around different types of allowances and support. And this should be on par with what's paid to foster carers. And that would be a really significant shift to where we are at the moment. But in doing so, you'd be keeping children out of care. At the moment, a local authority would only pay somebody who might be a family member, who might be a kinship carer being assessed as a foster carer, if that child was in care. This is about trying to prevent children coming into care, but still giving them the same support they get if they're in care. That makes sense financially. So a big significant shift. Again, needs to be funded, needs to be paid for, of course. Then there's a very significant section in here around homes for children in care. So when children have to come into the care system, they can't live with their family or they can't live with an extended family member. There's something around the right placement as near to home as possible. Ideally, a family placement, but for some children, they might need to be in residential care, maybe more specialist residential care. So there's quite a lot in here around work the government needs to do around recruitment of foster carers, which again isn't new, but it's really putting something in here about a national foster care recruitment programme, this ambition to recruit 9,000 foster carers in the first year to try and really increase that sufficiency. But there's a really big section in here as well around the work to do to try and tackle the external residential market. And I'll talk more about that in a few slides' time, because there's been some adjacent work that's also been carried out alongside the care review by the Care Markets Authority, looking particularly at external residential placement and the cost and the quality around that. And this really big concern that we've got, and that I've got, and my professional association has got, and I'm sure you would have, around the profits really from the public purse of external agencies who are essentially looking after children that are in the care system, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. There's a big section around realising the potential of the workforce, so that's about an early years framework and around that plan really for social workers in the first 5 years of their post-qualifying experience. And lots in here about tackling agency social work. Social work agencies, not agency social workers, but social work agencies, and really trying to get tougher in that space and to introduce legislation around how that market is regulated, so that we can try and stop the attrition, stop the move really of social workers going into agency and so on, which I can talk more about as well. And then just finally, a system that is relentlessly focused on children and families. So this is talking about clear accountability frameworks, maybe a national framework, Ofsted needing to be much clearer really about the judgments they make and why they've made them, spelling out much clearer accountabilities and responsibilities in relation to inspection, the government acting much more decisively in areas that are drifting. So at the moment, if an area has a children's inspection and becomes inadequate, then the government will decide whether or not to intervene formally in that authority to test out whether or not there's the kind of capacity in the management team and the leadership team to run children's services. What this report is saying is if you've got local authorities that are requiring improvement, there should be more done to try and stop the drift to get people to good. And there's different ways in which you can do that. Just to say, and I'm sure you know this, Chair, it's been here before, our children's service judged outstanding, so we're in quite a good place at the moment. I thought I'd just get that in. Never miss an opportunity to say that. I just wanted to pick up very briefly on the Care Market Authority study, because this is really important, because the Care Market Authority launched this study into children's social care in England and Scotland and Wales in March, at the same time as the care review really, the care review started. And this was really looking at the real challenges that we've got, which has got significantly worse, post-pandemic and during the pandemic, around the availability and sufficiency of placements for children that need to be in the care system, and also the costs of children and the costs of external placements for children who are in care. And this is particularly around external children's homes rather than independent fostering agencies, if I'm honest, because the costs for external residential are significant. And there were concerns really around just how much of the cost per week for children who are in external residential placements was being preened off for the profits of the organisation. And we talk about a market, but it isn't really a market, because, the only customer is local authorities. And, you've got some really big providers out there that are providing, care in different forms, often in many different local authorities, because they've got a big kind of reach across the whole of the country. And we know just locally in Derby, that one of our significant pressures, Daniel and John and others will know this, is around the cost of external placements, because we just, we have a real challenge around having our own enough internal placements, but the cost of external placements and the availability of external placements, is like nothing I've ever experienced in 27 years in social work, really. So, we're in a really challenging space, as is everybody. And this report really highlighted, that there's a lack of placements in the right place at the right time for children, and that the larger providers are, surprise, surprise, making massive profits from this. And my professional association, the ADCS, is really impressing on the government to really kind of just ban providers that are, taking money from the public purse and being able to kind of maintain such high profits. And there needs to be, windfall taxes and so on to try and get these monies back, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. So an initial response from the Care Market Authority has been provided, and it makes a number of recommendations. And the government have said that they'll look at that alongside the recommendations that come out, or their response to the care review as well, which I'll talk more about in a minute. So the overall strengths in the review, just in terms of my reflection, I've touched upon this already a little bit, but I'll just kind of whip through this. So relationships at the core, and this is writ large, it's a golden thread really throughout the whole of the review, which I think is really positive, because we know that where children have got good relationships with their carers, with their social workers, with their family, with their friends, they achieve better outcomes. I mean, we see that, don't we, regardless of where we sit in the children's system. That's really important. It really tries to move from early help to family help in that kind of multidisciplinary context, and it talks about the importance of different partners working together, including social workers, and that's really important. Aims to keep more families at home. There's a real focus on what more can we do as a system to keep children with their families, with their friends, before coming into care, and how do we financially support those arrangements, but not pull children into the care system. There's a lot in there around how families should come together to make decisions about children in their family network before local authorities go into what's called the public law outline, and that's essentially a kind of legally term for the work we have to do with families if we've got concerns about whether or not we need to be issuing care proceedings and going to court often for children to be removed. There's a whole raft of things we have to do before that, and this would just strengthen that process really and give more options, I think, and potentially families some financial recompense in terms of supporting their children. There's a big emphasis on kinship care. There is a proposal to have a windfall tax on the profits of the large external organisations that are creaming off the public purse in terms of the external placement market, which I think everybody would probably support. National Foster Care Campaign I've reflected on. There's a proposal in here, a recommendation around care leavers being a protected characteristic, which I think could be positive, thinking about our care leavers as a cohort. It really kind of strengthens the early careers framework for social work. Talks about national pay scales, which would be, potentially could be really significant as well. There's a lot in here about regulating agencies that provide social workers to organisations, making it a requirement that social workers need to have at least 3, if not 5 years experience post-qualifying before they go to an agency, which would be really good, because we're seeing, certainly in the region, not so much in Derby, but in the region, we're seeing social workers that maybe do a year in practice once they've got their degree, and then they move to an agency really quickly. We weren't seeing that pre-pandemic, but we are seeing that now because of the way in which, there's more flexibility around working in a virtual world and so on. So that would tighten up on those things. Just this kind of view that there needs to be better join up around different government departments in terms of how things are joined up, their better coherence, looking at the role of inspection, more transparency around judgments, and just this kind of financial literacy that kind of underpins it. So last slide, then we can get into any kind of Q&A. So where we are on this is that we were expecting the government to publish their response and their implementation plan before the end of this calendar year. That slipped, and that slipped very recently, and that's now moved to early 2023. And you might say, well, what does early 2023 mean? Is that January? Is that June? Where are we at with that? What I do know, because our president of the ADCS has been involved in the implementation board and has seen confidentially the kind of implementation plan. So it is literally ready to come out. So we're expecting that to come out in January, actually, which is good news in that sense. And it's going to be a really important milestone, really, because that's going to set out what and how the government are going to respond to the 80 recommendations under those 6 themes. So we're all really keen to see exactly how that lands, and whether or not some of those actions need to have primary legislation, whether or not there's things they can do without legislative changes. We need to understand the detail of that, really. The implementation board has been set up, and the president and the vice president of the ADCS are involved in that, and it involves a range of stakeholders, and also young people and carers are involved in that as well. And that's going to be really important in terms of driving forward, I think, the changes that need to be made. And the DfE intend, through engagement, cross-government working and policy development, to really try and carry on the debate. I have to say, in terms of the civil servants in the DfE, they are really engaged in this, and we're definitely beyond the talking stage. We're into the how do we kind of take this forward. And you know, the Secretary of State, Gillian Keegan, has been appointed in the last 6 to 8 weeks. You know, he signalled her commitment to taking this forward as quickly as possible, which can only be a positive thing as well. And as I said, the ADCS are actively engaged in this. So, Chair, that's the kind of presentation, but happy for any reflections or questions. I know I kind of spoke very quickly, but I hope that's given you a kind of overview of where things are as I see it currently.
Yes, thank you, Andy, and thank you for all the work you've done on this. It's very comprehensive. You've obviously been doing a lot of work in the background on this, and I'm sure that's appreciated by everyone here today. Do we know if the government are committing any funding to this at all as yet, or?
Yes, it's a really good question. What I do know is that there are conversations taking place with the Treasury, because I mean, in terms of how government works, you need to make friends with the Treasury, and it's important for each of the government departments to ensure that the rationale and the kind of literacy behind the proposals is well understood, because they have to almost argue the case for change for the Treasury. Who will ask lots of questions, just like our finance officers would, in our own respective organisations around, the plans to kind of spend money and the plans to, invest. So, the Treasury absolutely understand that investment will be required. And the figures that the review came up with were based on, a lot of analysis. They weren't just kind of, quick figures that were done, in half a day. And when you look at the review at the back, it's full of how they've done that. So I think the answer is yes. How and what that will translate to, I think, remains to be seen. And of course, the wider financial economic context that we're operating in and the government is operating in is significantly more challenged now than it was when the McAllister Review was published. But, to some extent, this is a real test, isn't it, of, the government's commitment to what's in the review. And, as I understand it, I've not seen the implementation plan, but, talking to the president of the ADCS only last week about it, it's very detailed, and it wouldn't come out without a sense of there being a kind of financial package to help us deliver it.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor?
Yes, Chair. Andy, I don't know how much detail there is on how they're going to create 9,000 foster places, because I mean we've been waiting to hear that for decades, I presume. I mean, it'd be interesting to know whether there's anything concrete in there. The windfall tax sounds like a really good idea, as long as there's a load of extra funding and they're going to reclaim it through windfall tax rather than just set a windfall tax and not recycle the money. That I'd be concerned that they wouldn't recycle the money unless they put like a pay cap on these private companies that are just robbing us blind. And the thing about the regional care cooperatives, I mean, is that something like a bit like Adoption East Midlands for fostering, or is it?
Good points, John. I think that on the recruitment of foster carers, I think that the devil's in the detail. And you're right, this isn't a new thing. We've been talking about recruitment and national recruitment campaigns, and there have been national recruitment campaigns in recent years, which, haven't yielded, I think, what the initial target may have been. And, we've done work within Derby around recruitment of foster carers. We're doing work at the moment across the Derby-Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire footprint around whether there's anything more we can do across D2N2 to kind of put our collective muscle together to try and, do more around recruitment. I think, there would need to be clearly a sense of what has worked well in local authorities around recruitment, and are there things that can be scaled up. So I think, the DfE haven't got all the answers. I think some of this will need to be co-produced with the sector and with, National Foster Care Association, and we'll need to try and work out what's worked and what hasn't worked. you know, but there is something as well, isn't there, around how do you market what being a foster carer is and isn't, try and, you know, myth bust, but also to ensure that you've got, you know, a good targeted recruitment campaign. So I think, without the devil's in the detail, I think there. What I'm picking up is that, you know, the DfE I suspect that the implementation plan will have, you know, probably themes around the chapters, and there will be further work that needs to be done with the sector to try and take some of those things forward. But there'll be some things that can only be done by the DfE. So, for example, you know, one thing that's very close to my heart is around the kind of regulation of agency, social work agencies, because that's what's killing us at the moment. Because, you know, you can, you know, leave your local authority role one day and the next day you can be working for an agency and you can be earning, you know, up to £20 more an hour than you would in a local authority. You know, and you can be sitting next to somebody who's a social worker employed by Derby on a particular salary, and you can be earning, you know, £20 more an hour, and that's really, really difficult. And we haven't really got any kind of power to stop it, you know, because the market is unregulated. You know, we haven't got any confidence around how agencies develop social work for their CPD, you know, and it's just a completely different space to it was, you know, even 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, I was a medal manager and senior manager in children's social care. We, you know, agencies were kind of, you know, we didn't even have to get into that space. So we're in a completely different world now, albeit that was, you know, 10, 15 years ago. I think on the windfall tax, I think, you know, that there's something, isn't there, about how do you manage that market in a way that stops large companies exploiting local authorities and creaming off the public purse. And, you know, there's a real challenge in terms of, you know, the fact that we talk about a market, but it's really a monopoly. It's not a market. You haven't got lots of different, you know, people running stalls, have you? You've got, you know, you've got 2 or 3 big players. You've got some smaller, you know, more family-based ones, probably more on the IFA market, the fostering market, and the residential market. So how do you regulate that? And are there opportunities to kind of, you know, have something that's much more nationally set around fees? Is there a way in which, you know, the government can actually kind of step in there and kind of, you know, create opportunities through, you know, windfall tax, what they do with some of the big energy companies. All these things need to be explored. So I'm going to be really interested in how that is framed in the implementation plan, because that is getting worse, not better, because, you know, the market is so challenged at the moment. The regional care cooperatives, when you read it in the report, it just sounds so straightforward. So this would be essentially, you know, kind of organisations that would take responsibility for, you know, running residential care, foster care, and would, you know, take over the kind of commissioning and the recruitment and the running. The children would still be in care to Derby, but it would be kind of coordinated with regional care cooperative. I think the challenge with that, and I think there are a number of challenges, is that, you know, it kind of oversimplifies, I think, some, you know, what's required. And it oversimplifies, I think, some of the challenges around how you need to develop a relationship with the market. And, you know, for me, the starting point is what is it, you know, what are the regional care cooperatives trying to resolve? What's the questions it's trying to answer? And actually what we need is we need more placements local to the child's home, ideally that enable them to stay with their family and friends, but if not, then, you know, placements that are with ideally foster carers near home that help children develop their, you know, potential. You know, not, which I think is a risk for the regional care cooperatives. If you happen for the East Midlands, say, you know, you could have a child that's in Derby, which is the case now to some extent, you know, placed within the regional care cooperative placement in, you know, the back end of, you know, Rutland or down in Northamptonshire. You know, it's about something that's much more locally driven. And we're doing a lot of work locally across the D2N2 footprint around fostering and also around how we commission residential care. So I think that, you know, we just need to see what comes out of the implementation plan around the regional care cooperatives. But I think because there has been, you know, in the last 10 years, regional adoption agencies, which for Derby is a D2N2 footprint, I think there's a view that you could do that for, you know, residential and foster care, but I think it's more complicated than adoption, because the market, you know, is much more, it's not, you know, a one-size-fits-all, I guess, in the way that adoption is much more contained, isn't it?
Thank you. Any more questions? No more questions. So Move on to the recommendations then. To consider the presentation and make further comment or recommendation following discussion on the presentation received. As a board, I think, you know, we should do what we can to support the fantastic work that Andy's doing there. I mean, do you think, Andy, it'd be beneficial for the board to write to the Secretary of State and, you know, state the challenges we have here in Derby and the need to invest in implementation and change? Would that be helpful?
I mean, I wonder, Chair, whether I think we need to see what's in that implementation plan. There's something about timing of this. I wanted to bring this tonight because we've been talking about it for a long time, and I was hoping that we might have even had the implementation plan by now because it was meant to be out, you know, this side of Christmas. I think we need to see what's in that plan because that plan will spell out some of the areas around investment. Because I think if we were to write now, I think they just say, well, the plan's coming out. Yeah. You know, maybe there's something about, you know, getting the plan, understanding what's in it, and then bringing that back here as appropriate, and then seeing what the gaps are, I think, because I think that probably would mean if you wanted to then write, you can do it from a more informed position, I think.
Absolutely, I would agree with that. So I would recommend then that we bring it back when the implementation plan is published. Any further comment or recommendation? No, we're all happy with that. We'll bring it back when the implementation plan is published. Yeah. Okay. And thank you for your time. Thank you, Andy. Okay, so moving over now to item 8, which is the work programme. Are we all happy with the current work programme? Is there anything you'd like to add on there? Yep, like the household support on the next agenda as well. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to the next item, if there's no further comment on that, which is the topic review scoping document, item 9. So the recommendation is to consider and approve the scope of the topic review as stated in the papers. I hope you've all read it. Are we all happy with that? Is there any further comment? No? So we agree we're all happy with that then? Yeah, so that's passed. Okay, thank you, and thank you to everybody coming this evening. Thank you for your time. I hope you all have a very nice Christmas and a Happy New Year. And we'll see you in the new year. Thank you. Thanks. Bye.